It begins with a chisel, a stonemason's tool, no different from the thousands that carved emperors' names into every victory arch, every milestone, every public wall across 1,000,000 square miles of conquered ground. For years, its only task was to add names to the permanent record of the world. Then, on the 18th of September, AD 96, that common tool was handed a new order, not to create, to erase. The command was precise. Find one name, wherever it stood in bronze or stone, and gouge it out, strike by strike, until only a rectangular scar remained, an empty rectangle where a ruler used to be, a blank patch of wall that was itself a message. This man is now illegal to remember. The name was Domitian. The official story, written by the men who outlived him and toasted his death, is simple. A monster, a paranoid tyrant who demanded worship as a living god, drained the treasury, and terrified the Senate into silence. Suetonius, a young man in the city when it happened, gives us the aftermath. Senators calling for ladders inside the Senate House. Senators climbing to tear down shields, bearing the emperor's face and shattering them on the marble. Voices shouting for his memory to be scoured from the earth entirely. But the things they failed to destroy tell a different story. Coins pulled from the soil after 2,000 years show an economy of remarkable stability, silver purity holding steady across his whole reign. The foundations of frontier forts show a border defended and managed with cold professionalism. The stones of Rome itself, from the Colosseum to the Palatine, show a capital not bled dry, but rebuilt on a scale that would shape the city for 3 centuries. The written record screams tyrant. The ground beneath our feet describes one of the most capable administrators the empire ever produced. This is not a biography. It is a forensic investigation into a 2,000-year-old cold case where the verdict handed down by history and the evidence buried in the earth point in opposite directions. We will start with what survives: the coins, the forts, the scarred stone, and we will read them the way a coroner reads a body, working backward from the wound to the truth. Before we open the file, let us know which city and country you are watching from in the comments below. And if you believe investigations like this one matter, take a moment to subscribe and support the project. You're watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. Our investigation begins with a single object, and it is not a body. It is a slab of bronze, small enough to hold in 2 hands, now lying under museum glass, a military diploma. In the Roman world, this was ordinary paperwork, the kind of thing issued in bulk. A soldier finished his 25 years on the frontier, and the state gave him this tablet as proof. He was now a Roman citizen, his marriage recognized, his children legitimate. 2 copies were made of each, one displayed publicly in Rome behind the Temple of Augustus, one carried home by the veteran and buried with him or handed down to his sons. Thousands were struck. Bureaucratic, unremarkable, dull. This one is Exhibit A. Look at the surface, a list of honors, a date, the names of the consuls in office that year, and then, cut into the metal itself, a clean rectangular wound. Where the emperor's name once stood, someone took a chisel to it. The letters that spell Domitian's have been scraped down to nothing, leaving a smooth trough in the bronze. This is not the soft blur of 2,000 years of weather. Weather rounds edges and eats them slowly. This is sharp. This is deliberate. Someone stood over this tablet with a hammer and a blade and hunted a name until it was dead. And here is what turns one damaged tablet into a case. The same wound appears everywhere. On the architraves of temples in Ephesus, where the limestone blocks still carry the empty patch at eye level. On the stone gates of forts along the Rhine. On the plinths of statues in the North African cities of Lepidus Magna and Bulla Regia. On milestones sunk into roads that no longer lead anywhere. Always the same name, always the same rectangular hole. A soldier in Britain and a mason in Syria, and a clerk in Egypt all reached for the same blank space in the same year. That is not a coincidence. That is an order. Somebody in Rome decided a man should cease to have ever existed, and the machine obeyed across 3 continents. The Romans had a name for this later. Damnatio memoriae, the damning of memory. It was among the harshest sentences the state could pass, worse in one sense than execution, because it reached beyond death and tried to unwrite the fact of a life. His acts were annulled. His name was struck from the calendar, the very month of October, which he had renamed Domitianus after himself, quietly went back to being October. Only a handful of emperors ever received this sentence in full. Domitian's was the most thorough the empire had yet attempted. So we work backward, the way you read an injury before you know the story behind it. To find the motive, we call our first witness, not one of the men who held a dagger that September morning, a man who held a pen. His name is Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus, and he is our way in. He was not a senator, not a soldier, not a player in the quiet war of poisons and successions being fought inside the palace. He was a scholar, an outsider to power, about 27 years old, and living in the city when Domitian was killed. His father, Suetonius Latus, had served as a military tribune with the 13th Legion at the First Battle of Bedriacum in AD 69. So the son had grown up close enough to power to smell it without ever holding it. Years later, under Trajan and Hadrian, he would be given a key to the imperial archives, and he would use it to write the lives of the emperors. But in AD 96, he was simply a young man on a Roman street, watching the ruling class come apart in public. What he describes is not a tidy handover of power, it is a frenzy. He tells us the senators' joy was wild, unrestrained. He tells us they did not merely feel relief that the emperor was dead, they wanted to see it undone in front of their own eyes. Suetonius records them shouting inside the Senate house, calling for ladders to be carried in, climbing up to tear down the shields and painted portraits that bore the dead man's face, and smashing them on the marble floor. He gives us their words, the insults they hurled at a corpse that was not even in the room. This was not the calm of men who had removed a problem. This was 15 years of held breath let out at once. We have a second witness to the same room, writing a century later. Cassius Dio, a senator himself, drew on sources now lost to us. He records that the Senate did not stop at portraits. They voted to scrape away his inscriptions and abolish his memory. And Dio adds the detail that they had feared this man so completely while he lived that not one of them had dared move against him openly for years. There is a third voice, too. The younger Pliny, who had been a magistrate under Domitian, later wrote of the day with a strange delight, describing how the people took pleasure in dashing the emperor's proud statues to the ground, in seeing the bronze faces battered and melted. 3 witnesses, an outsider, a later insider, and a survivor who had held office under the dead man, and all 3 agree on the emotion. Terror, then release, then vengeance. Suetonius matters most for one reason. He documents the feeling. He tells us that for the men in that chamber, Erasing Domitian was not policy, it was personal. Whatever this emperor had done to them, it had left a hunger that a simple death could not satisfy. They needed the name gone from the walls. They needed the memory made illegal. That hunger was then handed to one of the most efficient administrations the ancient world ever built. The erasure was not left to a mob with torches. It became a formal act. The Senate passed the decree, and the Roman state carried it out with the same cold competence it used to move grain from Egypt and pay legions on the Danube. Picture what that actually required. A messenger takes a sealed scroll and rides north out of Rome on the Via Flaminia, past the tombs that lined every road out of the city, past milestones that themselves bore the doomed name. He changes horses at the imperial post stations, the mansions, spaced roughly a day's ride apart. He rides through the night, resting only as long as it takes to mount a fresh animal. The cursus publicus, the state courier network built by Augustus, could move urgent news faster than anything the world would see again until the railway. He crosses the Alps. He passes through Gaul. He reaches the edge of Germania Superior and rides into a legionary fortress like Mogontiacum, the place we now call Mainz. He hands the scroll to the commander. The commander reads a name and issues an order. A centurion picks a handful of men and marches them not to a battlefield, but to the fortress gate. That gate was built on Domitian's own command, funded from his treasury, raised while he ruled. One of the soldiers is given a chisel. The morning is cold on the Rhine, the river running gray below the ramparts. He climbs a ladder, and he spends the afternoon chipping his own emperor's name off the stone he has walked beneath every single morning of his service. The sound of it carries across the parade ground, metal on stone, a slow tapping that does not stop until the light goes and the sentries change. There is a bitter edge to that scene the soldiers themselves would have felt. Many of these men owed everything to Domitian. He had raised legionary pay for the first time in over 100 years, from 300 sesterces a year to 400, the first increase since Julius Caesar. The army loved him for it. Suetonius admits as much, writing that the soldiers grieved for him and would have avenged him if they had found leaders to follow. In Rome itself, the Praetorian Guard forced the new Emperor Nerva to hand over the men who had killed Domitian, and one of the assassins was executed to satisfy them. So the hand that scraped his name off the Rhine gate may well have belonged to a man whose wages he had raised, working under protest. That is the shape of the whole event. Loyalty below, hatred above. Multiply that afternoon by the whole empire. The same ladder, the same chisel, the same blank rectangle in Britain and in Syria and in Egypt and along 1,000 roads. An industrial operation of forgetting, planned in one room in Rome and executed to the farthest wall of the Roman world. When you see it laid out like that, the scale is the point. Rome did not hate Domitian in a disorganized way. It hated him with logistics. Now, the case against him, the reason offered for all this effort. The charge was not that he was merely a poor ruler. It was that he was an enemy of the Roman way of life itself. And every source that makes this charge comes from the same place. The senatorial class he had spent 15 years frightening. Keep that in mind, because a coroner does not trust a witness who benefits from the death. They said he demanded to be addressed as Dominus et Deus, Master and God. Suetonius records that he began a public letter with the words, "Our Master and our God commands that this be done," not as flattery a courtier might offer, but as a formula pressed into official language. To withhold it was to insult him. and to insult him was treason. No emperor before had made a title of divinity a condition of daily speech while still alive. They said he shut himself inside the enormous new palace he had raised on the Palatine Hill. The Domus Flavia, designed by the architect Rabirius, was built to overwhelm. Its audience hall rose to a height that dwarfed any man who entered. Its walls were sheathed in colored marble, carried from Egypt, from Phrygia, from the Greek islands, and the floors were laid in patterns of purple and green stone. There was a story, repeated by Dio, that Domitian had the polished stone of one gallery set so that he could watch the reflections behind him and see anyone approaching from the rear. A man who ruled through decrees and through informers, and who no longer trusted the space at his own back. Suetonius preserves the detail that has followed Domitian for 2,000 years, that in the early part of his reign, the emperor would sit alone for hours with nothing to do but catch flies and pin them with the sharpened point of a writing stylus. When a visitor asked whether anyone was inside with the emperor, the courtier Vibius Crispus answered, "Not even a fly." The line was a joke told through the city. It was also a warning about the kind of solitude and the kind of habit that had settled over the palace. The image is meant to sicken you, and it does its work. A man holding absolute power over 60 million people, passing his private hours in small, pointless cruelty. The witnesses offer it as a preview of how he treated the living men of his court once he grew bored of insects. They said he turned the Senate into a chamber of fear. Here, Tacitus becomes our sharpest source, and his testimony is the most personal of all. Tacitus lived through it. In the opening of his biography of his father-in-law Agricola, the general who governed Britain, he describes the reign in one unforgettable image. They had watched, he writes, and their gaze had helped condemn men until they learned that silence was survival. He speaks of the color draining from men's faces, of the fear of being seen to fear. He names the worst stretch, the terror after the fall of the senators Helvidius Priscus, Herennius Senecio, and Arulinus Rusticus, when writing a book of praise for a dead republican could become a capital charge, and their books were burned in the forum by order of the state. The delatores, the professional informers, were everywhere. A joke made too loudly at dinner, a complaint about a new tax, a dream described to the wrong friend that could be read as a wish for the emperor's death. Suetonius records that a man named Metius Pompusianus was executed, in part because he kept a map of the world painted on his bedroom wall and had once been born under an imperial horoscope. Another was condemned for naming his slaves Mago and Hannibal. Any of it might reach the palace, and what followed a report was not an argument, but a trial, with a verdict already written. This is the monster the erasure was meant to bury, a ruler who had torn up the unspoken agreement between the emperor and the aristocracy, the quiet bargain that let both sides pretend the republic had never ended. But the erasure was not clean. It was rushed, and its mistakes are, for our investigation, a second body of evidence. Look closely at the statues of Nerva, the elderly senator who took the throne after Domitian died. He was 65, childless, chosen by the conspirators precisely because he threatened no one and could father no dynasty. Art historians studying the marble portraits have found a ghost inside them. The sculptors of AD 96 did not have the time or the fresh stone to carve their new emperor from scratch, so they took the statues of Domitian and recut the faces. But you cannot recarve a skull. You can only shave down what is already there. So Nerva's portrait sometimes sits on a head that is too long, with a jaw that does not quite match, a face stretched over another man's bone. It is Domitian wearing Nerva like a borrowed cloak. The dead emperor stares out from inside the man who replaced him. The inscriptions betray the same haste. Latin is exact about length, and the two names did not match. Domitian's is long, Nerva is short. When the masons gouged out the long name and cut the short one into the empty trench, they were left with a gap on either side, a stretch of blank stone framing the new word like a scar that refuses to close. Across the empire, the same problem repeated. Sometimes they filled the space with Nerva's fuller titles. Sometimes they left it raw. Either way, every one of those inscriptions carries a silence around the name of the living emperor. The act of deletion did not hide the missing man. It drew a rectangle around exactly where he used to be and pointed at it forever. There is one place where the erasure went further than mere stone. In the Roman Forum stood an equestrian statue of Domitian so large that the poet Statius wrote an entire poem in its praise, describing the bronze horse mid-stride, the emperor's raised hand seeming to still the very river gods around him, the base broad enough to hold a temple. It was among the grandest monuments in the city. After his death, it vanished so completely that archaeologists have never found a certain trace of it. The most celebrated bronze in Rome melted back into raw metal, its praise poem surviving only because a book outlasted a statue. That is the strange failure at the heart of this case. The most powerful state on earth ordered a man unmade, spent messengers and soldiers and years of stonework doing it, and produced instead a network of monuments to the very name it wanted gone. The scar is louder than the name would have been, and the poem lived while the bronze died. For a long time, this channel has done exactly this kind of work, prying open the buried corners of the past and refusing to accept the version written by the winners. We have built a community of people who are not content with the official story, who want to stand over the evidence themselves and read it. If that is you, if you feel the pull to look past the tidy narrative and into the raw, contradictory record, then you already belong here. Make it official. Join the Lineage, our channel's membership. It is more than a way to fund the research and production behind these investigations, though it does that, and it keeps this project independent enough to chase the difficult stories properly. It is how you step onto the team. Members get early access to new videos and other perks, but the real thing is this. You become a patron of the work, not just a witness to it. If you believe in what we do here, tap the join button and become part of the family that keeps it alive. So, the deletion was total in its intent and total in its reach. Ordered from the highest chamber of government, carried out by the full weight of the imperial machine, pressed into stone from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. And it failed. The scars are too obvious. The face beneath the mask is too clear. The attempt to erase Domitian became, against every wish of the men who ordered it, his most durable monument, which leaves us standing in front of a contradiction the stones cannot resolve on their own. The Senate wanted this man gone because he was, they swore, a tyrant, a paranoid god-king who terrorized Rome and bled it white. Suppose that is true. Suppose he was nothing more than that. Then how do we explain the other evidence, still sitting in the ground, still standing on the skyline of Rome, that this same monster was one of the most capable builders the city had ever known? Why did the soldiers who scraped his name off the gates weep for him? And why does the money he left behind, coin by coin, silver still pure after 2,000 years, tell a story his executioners never once mentioned? We seal Exhibit A back into its case and reach for the next piece. This one is small enough to sit in the palm of a gloved hand. It did not survive in a temple treasury. It came out of the dirt of a plowed field, part of a hoard someone buried in a moment of fear and never came back to dig up. A silver coin, a denarius, struck in Rome around AD 91. On one face, a man in profile, heavy jaw, hair thinning at the crown, ringed by the letters of his titles. On the other, the goddess Minerva, his chosen patron, upright with spear and shield. Domitian loved her above all the gods. He kept a shrine to her in his bedroom, and Suetonius tells us that shortly before his death he dreamed she had laid down her weapons and abandoned him, driving off in a chariot drawn by black horses. This is Exhibit B, and on its own, this ordinary coin tears a hole in the case against him. We are told Domitian bled the state dry to feed his own vanity, but the denarius says otherwise. Weigh it, test the metal, and the silver comes back close to 98% pure. That figure sounds like nothing. It is everything. To see why, you have to understand the slow theft that most emperors carried out against their own subjects. It was called debasement. You mix cheaper metal, usually copper, into the silver, and you strike more coins from the same amount of precious metal. The ruler grows richer overnight, but every coin already sitting in a farmer's purse is now worth a little less. Prices creep up. It is a hidden tax laid on every person in the empire at once, and it never announces itself in an edict. It is the reflex of a regime running out of money. Domitian did the reverse. His predecessors had poisoned the currency for years. Nero, back in the AD 60s, had cut both the weight and the purity of the denarius to pay for his fires and his golden house. Even Vespasian and Titus, Domitian's own father and brother, had let the standard slip to fund the Colosseum and the wars in Judea. The coinage that circulated when he took power was thin, gray, half-trusted in the marketplace. In AD 82, his first full year of rule, he did something close to reckless in its ambition. He raised the silver content back to the standard of Augustus, a full century before. He recalled the weak coins and restruck them, and when the treasury felt the strain a few years later, he did not simply crash the standard back down in a panic. He eased it a fraction, then held it there, a controlled correction. No emperor would match his best figure again for well over 100 years. This is not the hand of a spendthrift drunk on his own image. This is the signature of a man who thought in decades. And that number cost him. Imagine the machinery behind it. Edicts carried to every province, ordering imperial agents to seize the old coinage and condemn it. Fresh metal dug from the mines of Spain and the Balkans and shipped to the capital under guard. The mint beside the temple of Juno Moneta running hot, furnaces smelting the recalled silver, one crew pouring blanks, while another struck coins a single hammer blow at a time, the workshop loud with metal from before dawn. Every strike was an act of war against the men who profited from bad money, the money-lenders, the publicani, the tax farmers who had grown fat skimming the provinces, the senators who speculated on the gap between good coin and bad. He was dismantling their trade by decree. He chose the long stability of the empire over the goodwill of the men who mattered most in Rome. The coin in the hand is a statement. It says, the emperor runs the economy, not the Senate. It buys peace for the many and enemies among the few. And it is the first clue about where the real hatred was brewing. There is a second face to his money worth reading. Domitian was ruthless in raising revenue where he thought it just, and one of his measures still shocks the modern eye for its reach. Suetonius records that he pressed hard on a special tax laid on the Jews of the empire, the fiscus Judaicus, and that informers grew rich chasing men suspected of hiding their faith to avoid it. Suetonius says he once watched, as a young man, an old man of 90 stripped in a crowded court to check whether he was subject to the tax. He kept the tribute flowing, but he spent it on temples, on the army, on the border. He was not hoarding, he was building. From that one coin we can pull back and watch the same mind at work on the largest canvas Rome offered, the city itself. In AD 80, the year before, Domitian took the throne. Fire had swept the heart of the capital. It was the second great fire in 15 years, and it burned for 3 days and 3 nights. The Campus Martius lay in ash. The Pantheon of Agrippa was scorched. The Baths of Agrippa, the Theatre of Pompey, the Portico of Octavia, the Temple of Serapis, all damaged or gutted. Worst of all, the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Palatine Hill, the sacred heart of the whole Roman state, stood as a blackened shell against the sky. It had only just been rebuilt after the fire of AD 69. Now it was ruin again. Domitian did not patch it. He launched one of the most costly building campaigns the city had ever seen, paid for in part by the very reform of the coinage. He raised the great temple a 3rd time and roofed it in gilded bronze tiles. Plutarch, who saw the finished work with his own eyes, wrote that the gilding alone had swallowed more than 12,000 talents, and that Domitian was like a man sick with the disease of building who could never have enough of it. Plutarch meant it as a wound. It reads today as a receipt. He finished the Colosseum his father Vespasian and his brother Titus had begun, adding the upper tiers and the warren of chambers beneath the arena floor where the lifts and the beasts were held. He built a covered concert hall, the Odeon, seating thousands. He built a new stadium for foot races on the Campus Martius, part of a Greek-style festival he founded in AD 86, the Capitoline Games, held every 4 years with prizes for poetry, music, and athletics. That stadium's long curved outline still fixes the shape of one of Rome's most walked squares, the Piazza Navona. Stand in it now, and you are standing inside the track he laid, the houses along its edge following the line of his ancient seating. He restored the temple of the divine Vespasian, honored his dead brother Titus with an arch that still stands at the edge of the Forum, its carved relief showing the spoils of Jerusalem carried in triumph, and rebuilt so widely that later Romans joked he had put his name on everything while claiming merely to have restored it. But the project that carried his name most heavily rose on the Palatine Hill. There he cleared away the old tangle of aristocratic mansions and built in their place a single structure that changed what the word palace would mean for the rest of history. The Domus Flavia was not a house. It was an instrument of government carved in stone, a public wing for audiences, a private wing for the emperor, joined by courtyards, a basilica where he heard legal cases, and a throne hall whose ceiling rose so high it seemed to swallow the men who stood beneath it. The architect Rabirius clad the whole complex in marble hauled from Egypt, from Asia Minor, from the Greek islands, colors no single house had ever gathered under one roof. In the great dining hall, the triclinium, guests reclined, while fountains ran in the courtyards beyond, glimpsed through the columns, so the emperor dined framed by moving water and colored stone. The poet Statius, invited to one such banquet, wrote afterward that he had felt he was reclining among the gods. It was built to press a visitor down to his proper size. For 3 centuries after, every Roman emperor would rule from these rooms, and the word for the place, Palatium, taken from the very hill it stood on, became our own word palace. And here the political knife turns. The land under that palace had once held the homes of the old senatorial families. Now their descendants had to climb the Palatine as petitioners, wait in his antechambers, and cross his marble floors as supplicants on ground their own grandfathers had owned outright. They did not see a monument to Rome. They saw a monument to their own shrinking. The building told them, without a single word, that the age of the great families sharing power was finished, and that the emperor now stood not first among equals, but above them entirely. There is a story Pliny tells of a banquet at the palace so grim, the guests served on black dishes in a black room by attendants dressed as ghosts, that the senators expected to be killed before the night was out. It was a joke of the emperor's, but it told them exactly how little their lives weighed at his table. Now, we change our lens completely. We leave the gilded halls of Rome and travel to the raw edges of the empire, and we look at this reign through the eyes of men for whom the Senate's terror was a distant rumor, if they heard of it at all. Picture a centurion on the Danube, wrapped in a wool cloak against a wind coming off the river, his fingers stiff on the shaft of a spear, the far bank thick with the forests of the barbarians. To him, the great treason trials in Rome were noise from another world. What Domitian meant to him was concrete. It was the day the emperor raised the pay of the entire army for the first time in almost 100 years, lifting the annual wage by a full third, from 300 sesterces to 400. Not since Julius Caesar had a ruler done it. Suetonius records the change precisely. 3 extra gold pieces added to the 9 each soldier already drew. For the man on the frontier, that was not tyranny. That was an emperor who understood the empire stood on the shoulders of its soldiers and paid what they were owed. That same centurion may well have marched in Domitian's own campaigns, because the emperor did not rule from a couch in Rome as his critics implied. He went north himself. In A.D. 83, he led the war against the Chatti across the Rhine, and took the title Germanicus from it. Later, he fought a long, grinding war against the Dacians under their king Decebalus on the Danube. It cost Rome dearly. A whole legion, the 5th Alaudi, was destroyed in an ambush along with its eagle, and a praetorian prefect named Cornelius Fuscus fell with his men. There was a revolt, too, in A.D. 89, when Lucius Antonius Saturninus, governor on the Rhine, declared himself emperor with 2 legions behind him. The rising collapsed within weeks, when a thaw broke the ice on the river and stopped his German allies crossing to join him. Domitian marched north to crush the last of it, and the fear of a repeat sharpened every suspicion he carried afterward. The senators sneered that his triumphs were hollow, that he had bought slaves and dressed them as captured Germans to march in his parade. Tacitus repeats the jibe, but the frontier he left behind held. Decebalus was checked and bound by treaty. The line did not break for years after his death. For a provincial governor in Gaul or Africa, the reign felt like order arriving. Roads relaid, milestones reset, aqueducts carried into towns that had gone thirsty, and on the German frontier, a new kind of border took shape, the Limes Germanicus, a running line of more than 60 forts and something near 900 watchtowers strung together by a patrol road, turning a vague and bleeding edge into a marked, held, defensible line. Timber towers first, then rebuilt in stone, each within sight of the next, so a fire lit at one tower could carry the alarm down the whole chain within an hour. Beneath the modern soil of Germany, archaeologists still trace that line, post hole by post hole, ditch by filled-in ditch, running dead straight for miles across hill and valley. It was enormous in scale and in cost, and it kept that frontier quiet for generations after the man who built it had been scraped off its gates. Even our chief witness for the prosecution is forced onto the stand for the defense. Suetonius, after pages spent cataloging cruelty and paranoia, drops in one sentence that undoes much of his own portrait. He writes that under Domitian, the provincial governors were held on so tight a rein that they never showed more honesty or restraint than in these years. He admits, almost against his will, that the empire's territories were governed better then than before or since. The reason was simple and hard. Domitian's inspectors were feared because they could not be bought, and a governor caught stealing did not receive a warning. He received exile, or the axe. He was strict, too, about public decency and the old religion. He revived the buried punishment of Vestal virgins who broke their vows, condemning the chief Vestal Cornelia to be entombed alive, a sentence not carried out in living memory. To the elite, this was interference and cruelty. To the ordinary provincial, it meant a magistrate who was afraid to rob him, and an emperor who enforced the old law without fear or favor. The senators of Rome lived in dread of the emperor's informers. The farmer in Baetica or Bithynia lived in the most predictable empire he had ever known, with money that held its value and borders that held their shape. To sit with a contradiction this sharp, you need the sources that came through the fire of history intact. The book that anchors today's investigation is a work of forensic history at its finest, a full autopsy of a murdered reputation. It sets the archaeology and the written record side by side and builds a case that argues back against 2,000 years of propaganda. If you want to feel the full weight of this story, that volume belongs on your shelf, and it is waiting for you right now. Tap the View Products button on your screen. When the shop shelf opens, you will find not only that core text, but a chosen handful of other dark relics we have tracked down, objects meant to carry the weight of these lost worlds into your own hands. Take a moment to look while the story runs on. It is the surest way to support the channel and to begin your own archive of this history. The case is now in ruins. The prosecution, leaning entirely on the pens of the senatorial class, gave us a mad tyrant, a man who styled himself a god, who skewered flies for sport, who emptied the treasury to feed his ego. But the physical evidence stands against every count. The coins in the field argue for a fiscal manager of rare discipline. The buildings still standing in Rome argue for a planner whose vision outlasted him by 300 years. The forts and towers on the border argue for a commander who understood what holding an empire actually required. The army wept for him. The provinces were governed clean. Both stories cannot be true. A man cannot at once be the reckless monster who wrecked his country and the meticulous administrator who left it steadier and safer than it had been in 100 years. The story we inherited is splitting along its own seams, which forces a new question and a darker one. If the motive for his murder was not incompetence, not corruption, not defeat in the field, then what was it? The missing piece is not in what he did. Every ledger, every coin, every wall says he did his work, and did it well. The answer must lie in how he did it, and in who was standing closest to him when the knives came out. Because the men who signed his death warrant were not starving provincials or unpaid soldiers on the Danube. They were the ones who reclined in that marble hole while the fountains ran. They were the ones who ate at his table, and one of them, that September morning, would carry a hidden blade past the guards and into the emperor's own bedroom, where the shrine of Minerva stood against the wall, and the goddess, in his last dream, had already turned her back. Our final exhibit is not carved from stone or struck in silver. It is made of paper and reputation. It is the career record of the very men who wrote Domitian's history. Exhibit C. The survivors. Look at their names. Cornelius Tacitus, the sharpest historian Rome would ever produce. Pliny the Younger, a wealthy senator whose letters let us walk the corridors of the elite as if we were guests at their dinners. Quintilian, the most celebrated teacher of rhetoric in the city, the man every ambitious family paid to train their sons. These are the star witnesses for the prosecution. They handed down the verdict that has stood for 2,000 years. Monster. And they share one detail that changes how we must read every word they left us. They did not merely endure Domitian's reign, they rose in it. Tacitus began his climb through the offices of the state under the Flavians and held a praetorship in AD 88. That same year, he sat on the College of Priests, who oversaw the secular games. The grand religious festival Domitian revived to mark a new age of Rome. 3 days and nights of sacrifice and theater and chariot racing. He was serving abroad, holding a command the emperor had granted him through the worst years of the terror. He came home to a city full of fresh graves and wrote as a man who had not been there to die with the rest. Pliny held financial and legal posts under Domitian, prosecuted and defended cases in the emperor's own courts, and only later called that same emperor a savage beast in its den, lapping the blood of its own kin. Quintilian did better than either. Domitian handed him the tutorship of his 2 grandnephews, the sons of Flavius Clemens, the boys marked out as heirs to the throne. With the post came a fortune and the ornaments of a consul, the highest honor a teacher had ever been paid in Rome. Quintilian even wrote, while the emperor lived, that Domitian's own poetry outshone all the poets of Greece. These men were not hiding in cellars scratching forbidden pamphlets by candlelight. They were insiders. They wore the emperor's favor like a good wool cloak against the cold. Only after he was safely dead, and a fresh regime began handing out its own rewards, did they rediscover a lifelong buried loathing of the man who had promoted them. Here, in that gap between the paycheck and the eulogy, we find the motive at last. Their testimony is not a chronicle. It is a defense statement. It is the sound of clever men explaining at volume why their years of comfortable service under a tyrant should not be counted against them now. Tacitus half admits it himself. In the opening pages of the Agricola, he writes with something close to shame that his generation had survived by staying silent, that they had watched the Senate condemn good men and said nothing, that the shame of the living was heavier than the fate of the dead. He writes that they had led Helvidius and the others to prison with their own eyes, seared by the mere sight of so many faces stained with the blush of fear. That is not the voice of a rebel. It is the voice of a collaborator, and it is the more honest for it. He knew what he was. So strip away the noise and ask what the hatred was actually about. It was not corruption, because his auditors could not be bought. It was not military collapse, because the frontiers held under his own generals and his own hand. It was not a wrecked economy, because the silver in the coinage was the soundest in 100 years. It was about manners. It was about a lie Rome had told itself for a century, and one man's refusal to keep telling it. Augustus, the first emperor, had built his whole system on a careful fiction. He held every real lever of power, but he wrapped it in the worn language of the old republic. He called himself princeps, the first citizen, one among equals. He rose when senators entered. He asked their opinion on matters that needed no asking. He let them keep the purple-bordered togas and the ancient ceremonies and the warm sense that they still governed the world. It was theater, performed daily for 100 years, but the theater kept the great families content, and content men do not sharpen knives. Domitian tore up the script. He looked at the Senate and saw plainly what it had become, a dining club of rich men grieving for a republic that would never return, and he treated it as exactly that. In AD 85 he took the title Censor Perpetuus, Censor for life, a permanent grip on the role of the Senate that no man before had claimed forever. He could raise a man onto that role. He could strike a man off it with a single stroke of the pen. He decided who counted as a senator at all. He turned the proudest assembly on earth into a staff he could hire and dismiss. He forced them to attend him, to greet him as master and God, to sit in silence while he judged cases from a raised platform in his own basilica. He entered the games wearing the purple and gold of a triumphing general and a crown bearing the images of the gods, and made the priests beside him wear crowns stamped with his own face alongside them. For men who traced their blood to the founders of the city, to Aeneas and to the gods themselves, being managed like household clerks was a wound no salary could close. That resentment turned to open fear in the last stretch of his reign, and it had a starting gun. In January of AD 89, Lucius Antonius Saturninus, the governor of Germania Superior, declared himself emperor at Mogontiacum with 2 legions behind him, and he had struck a bargain with the German tribes across the Rhine to bring their warriors over the ice to join him. The revolt collapsed within weeks. A sudden thaw broke the river ice and stranded the Germans on the far bank, unable to cross. The loyal commander Lapius Maximus crushed what remained, and then, the sources say, burned Saturninus' private papers unread, so that no innocent name could be dragged into the emperor's suspicion. It was mercy. Domitian did not learn it. Something in him broke with that revolt. His fear that the aristocracy hated him in secret was now proven in the blood of 2 legions, and a proven fear feeds only on itself. The informers were loosed on the Senate. Here the account of Tacitus and Pliny is true, and it is the darkest part of the whole record. Men were charged with treason on threads. Herennius Senecio was condemned for writing a life of the republican martyr Helvidius Priscus. Arulinus Rusticus died for praising Thrasea Paetus, a senator of an earlier reign. Their books were gathered and burned by the state in the open forum, the smoke drifting over the crowd. And Tacitus says the men who lit those fires believed they could silence the voice of the Roman people and the conscience of mankind by burning paper. A philosopher was condemned for his Stoic teaching, and Domitian expelled all philosophers from Rome and from Italy, driving them out onto the roads. Metius Pompusianus was destroyed in part for keeping a painted map of the world on his wall, red as the daydream of a man who wished to own it, and for having been born, decades before, under a horoscope that promised a throne. Even a senator's private jokes could be fatal, and Suetonius names men killed for a stray word at dinner. In a system where one man holds every power, suspicion alone is a sentence. Domitian had made the Senate his enemy through humiliation. Now he was killing it out of dread. The point of no return came inside his own family. Flavius Clemens was a consul, a quiet and unremarkable man, married to Domitian's own niece Flavia Domitilla, and father to the two boys the emperor had adopted and renamed Vespasian and Domitian, marking them as his heirs. In AD 95, with Clemens barely out of his year as consul, Domitian had him arrested and executed on a charge of atheism, a word the sources use for drifting toward Jewish or Christian belief. His wife was banished to a barren island off the coast. To the small circle who ran the palace day and night, the message could not have been clearer. Blood was no shield. The closer you stood to the throne, the sharper a target you became. If the emperor would kill the father of his own chosen heirs, then no rank, no service, no kinship could save a man. The plot against Domitian was conceived in the shadow of that execution. It was not born of ambition, not a rival reaching for the purple. It was cold arithmetic done by frightened men who had watched the pattern and understood their own names were coming up. Even his wife, the sources say, was drawn in. The Empress Domitia Longina, whom he had once loved, once divorced over a scandal involving the actor Paris, and then taken back, is named by Suetonius and Dio among those who knew the plot was coming, said to have found her own name written on a list of the condemned in the emperor's own hand. Whether from fear for her life or grief over the murdered kin, the woman who shared his bed may have shared the knowledge that would empty it. The killing, when it came, was not the marble spectacle of Julius Caesar bleeding at the foot of Pompey's statue while the whole Senate watched. It was quiet, domestic, and close. The men who arranged it were the men who ran his household, who knew the hour he rose, and the room he slept in, and the blade he kept beneath his pillow. Parthenius, the chamberlain who controlled all access to the emperor's private rooms. A steward and freedman named Stephanus, who was under suspicion of embezzlement and had a reason to act before the axe found him. With them stood Clodianus, a subaltern of the guard, a decurion of the bedchamber, and a former gladiator, along with others of the palace staff. Cassius Dio adds that the two praetorian prefects themselves knew and did not stop it. They had chosen the hour carefully. Domitian, gripped by dread in his last months, had lined the walls of a colonnade with polished moonstone so that he could see, in its mirror surface, anyone approaching him from behind. He had asked the astrologers the hour of his own death and been told it would come at midday. He had grown so afraid of that fifth hour that on the morning itself he kept asking the time, and each servant, in on the plot, told him it was already the sixth. Believing the dangerous hour had passed, he relaxed and went to deal with what he thought was routine business. On the 18th of September, AD 96, they moved. Stephanus had worn a bandage of wool on his left arm for days, telling the household he had strained it, letting them all grow used to the sight until it drew no second glance. Folded inside the wrappings was a dagger. He asked for a private word with the emperor, saying he had uncovered a conspiracy and held the proof in his hand. Domitian dismissed the room and took the document and bent his head to read. As his eyes ran down the page, Stephanus tore the blade from the bandage and struck him low, in the groin. The emperor was 44, tall, and still strong. He did not fall. He seized his attacker, and they went down together onto the floor, grappling, Domitian's hands closing on the blade itself, his fingers cut to the bone as he tried to wrench it away, trying even to claw out the younger man's eyes. He shouted for a boy who tended the bedroom shrine to run and fetch the dagger from beneath his pillow and to call the guards. The boy found only the empty hilt. Parthenius had drawn out the steel days before, and left the useless handle in its place. No guards came. The other conspirators burst through the door, and it ended after 7 wounds in a bedroom lined with colored marble beneath the shrine of Minerva, to whom the emperor had prayed every morning of his reign. Stephanus was cut down by loyal servants who rushed in too late to save their master, but soon enough to take one of the killers with them. Domitian lay dead on the floor at midday, exactly as the stars had promised him. Not a senator in the forum, not a general on a battlefield, his own servants in the room where he slept. The aftermath told the truth of the reign more plainly than any single act within it. Word reached the Senate, and the Senate did not mourn. It erupted. It voted the damnatio memoriae on the spot, called for the ladders to be carried into the chamber, tore down the shields and portraits, and dashed them on the marble, and rejoiced as though a foreign king had been beaten in war. Suetonius says they heaped on the dead man every insult they had swallowed for 15 years, and moved that his name be scoured from every record. The Praetorian Guard felt something wholly different. They had not been told of the plot, and to them the murder of the man they were sworn to shield was a betrayal of the one thing that gave their lives meaning. They demanded the killers by name. When the new emperor Nerva, a mild old senator raised to the throne within hours of the murder, tried to shield them, the guard mutinied under their prefect Casperius Aelianus. They dragged Parthenius and the rest out and killed them, and forced the trembling Nerva to stand before the people and give public thanks for the murder of his own protectors. It was the deepest humiliation of his brief reign, and it drove him, before he died a year later, to adopt a hard soldier named Trajan as his heir to keep the army quiet. The armies on the frontiers, who had marched behind Domitian in Germany and Dacia and been paid by him more generously than by any emperor in a century, were furious and looking for a leader to avenge him. Some soldiers, Suetonius says, wanted at once to declare him a god, and the ordinary people of Rome, the million who filled the tenements and the streets of the city he had raised twice from ashes, felt almost nothing at all. They did not riot for him, they did not dance on his grave. His death simply did not reach them. That indifference is the last piece of evidence, and it closes the case. The hatred of Domitian was never the hatred of Rome. It was not a people rising against a despot. It was a concentrated poison, brewed in 2 rooms only, the Senate House and the private corridors of his own palace. It was the fury of 600 proud men whom he had made to feel like paid attendants, and the terror of a handful of servants who had counted the pattern and knew they were next. The provinces did not hate him, the legions did not hate him, the streets of Rome did not hate him. The men who wrote the books hated him, and the men who wrote the books are the reason we ever called him a monster. And so, after the decrees and the smashed statues and the scraped stone, the story comes to rest on one small human act that outlived all of it. The Senate denied him a state funeral. No procession, no place among the Flavians in the great mausoleum. According to Suetonius, his body was carried out of the palace on a common bier, the plain kind used to bury the city's poor, borne by the public undertakers as a final cheap insult. But his old nurse took him. Her name was Phyllis, and she had held him as an infant and raised him in the house of Vespasian when the family was still poor and unknown, before the throne was ever in their reach. She brought the body to her own modest villa on the road outside Rome, and had it burned there in secret, at real risk to her own life had any informer reported her. Later, when the danger had cooled, she gathered his ashes with her own hands and carried them quietly into the temple of the Flavian family, the shrine Domitian himself had built on the site of the house where he was born. There she mixed them with the ashes of Julia, his niece, the girl he had loved. One woman's private loyalty set against the public rage of the most powerful assembly on earth, and it is hers that lingers. To the men who wrote him down, he was a flat monster with nothing inside. To the woman who had known him from the cradle, he was worth the danger of treason. The attempt to erase his name failed, and its very scars became his monument. The attempt to erase his works failed more completely still, because the foundations of the city stand on them, and no chisel ever cut that deep. Thank you for staying with this investigation all the way to its last line. If it earned your respect, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and send it to one person who understands that history is not only written, it is edited, buried, and now and then forged outright by the men who happen to survive it. You've just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube. Another investigation is opening on your screen right now. Tap it and keep walking with us into the buried past. We'll be waiting.